Hercule Poirot and the letter sealed in blue blood. Chapter 1. The Last Toast at Lavell Palace. The doors of the majestic Lavell Palace opened that evening with the controlled noise that only true aristocracy can achieve. Illustrious guests, barons, ambassadors, exiled artists and disaffected heiresses filtered beneath the crystal chandeliers that hung like inverted constellations, reflecting the grandeur of an era that refused to die. In the centre of the room, draped in a midnight blue dress embroidered with antique pearls, the Marquise de Lavell, Hélène de Rochefort, reigned with a glass of champagne in her hand and a carefully trained smile. Her surname, of French lineage, still resonated in the salons of Paris, although the bulk of her fortune now lay buried in litigation, failed investments, and family secrets. That night, the Marchioness was celebrating her 60th birthday, and, according to rumours, she was also about to announce something else. A change in her will. "My dear Alfred," he whispered to his personal lawyer, a skinny grey-haired man who seemed to live eternally among sealed papers and confusing clauses, "make sure the letter is in the safe before midnight." "Of course, madame," said Alfred Moreau, with a slight bow. "No one will have access to it except you, or me if the law requires it." At exactly midnight, a sharp, echo-free shot interrupted the waltz, echoing from the grand piano. There were screams, broken glass, and an abrupt silence. The Marchioness lay collapsed in her private study. The window was locked from the inside. The only key, hanging around her neck, was still in place. The letter she had claimed would change the lives of everyone present was gone. 3 days later, the train from Paris arrived at Lavell station with Swiss punctuality. An impeccably dressed man stepped off. A symmetrical moustache, a light grey coat, and a hat tilted with mathematical precision. "Ah, the provincial air," said Hercule Poirot, with a slight grimace. "It's always smelled of cabbage and betrayal to me." Inspector Lemoine, an old acquaintance of the French police, was waiting for him, with a weathered face and eyes that, despite his experience, was still filled with frustration when faced with the mysteries of high society. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with a mixture of relief and resignation, "thank you for coming. This case is pointless." "Do you have any truly interesting crimes?" replied Poirot, adjusting his gloves. "Tell me about the letter." A letter sealed in blue blood, as she called it. She said it contained the truth that would change the history of Lavell. No one knows what it contained, only that she was going to read it after the toast. She turned up dead before doing so, and the letter has disappeared. Poirot nodded, slowly. "So, mon ami, it will be our task to find not only the murderer, but also the truth that he or she wanted to silence." That afternoon, Poirot visited the palace. The gilded doors, the marble floor, the portraits of nobles with eyes that judged from centuries past. Everything exuded a beautifully disguised decadence. He was received by Geneviève, the Marquise's niece, young and melancholy, whose eyes seemed to have wept more than her face would allow. "She wasn't liked by everyone," she said quietly, as she led Poirot to the study where the crime took place. "But no one believed she would end up like this. Not here, among us." Poirot looked around. The desk was untouched. No sign of a struggle, no fingerprints. The weapon was still missing. The window was sealed, the key still hanging around the victim's neck, as if the Marchioness herself had wanted to make sure no one got in. Or perhaps no one got out. Poirot approached a vase of withered flowers and smelled it with disdain. "Too much perfume," he murmured. "Too much silence." He turned slowly on his heels and whispered, "Who else had access to this room?" Geneviève hesitated. "Everyone, and no one. Everyone knew about the studio, but no one had the key, only my aunt." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet someone came in, and killed someone. A locked scene is like a well-told lie, perfect, until you look closely." His eyes fell on a barely visible dried drop of wax on the floor, then on a small scratch on the keyhole, and finally on a chair shifted exactly 32 centimetres from its symmetrical position under the lamp. The murder of the Marchioness was not just any crime. And Poirot, with his small grey cells, I already felt that beneath that surface of broken nobility, the first glimmerings of deception were beginning to reveal themselves. Chapter 2. The Heirs and the Secrets. The next day Lavell Palace was filled not with music, but with murmurs. The heirs, summoned by the notary for the reading of the original will, in the absence of the mysterious letter, arrived one by one, bringing with them feigned mourning, pent-up tension, and overly calculated glances. Hercule Poirot, dressed in his light grey suit and blue silk scarf, was already in the portrait-room, silently observing the parade of faces. "Look, Inspector Lemoyne," he whispered as he saw the first one enter. "Each one wears the jewel like a mask, but they've practiced too much in front of the mirror." The first to arrive was Jacques de Rochefort, the eldest son of the Marchioness's late brother. A businessman of investments and scandals, his perfectly trimmed beard didn't entirely conceal the wear and tear of age. "He never approved of my business dealings," he told the inspector in a neutral voice. "But he kept inviting me, as if he wanted to keep a closer eye on me." Then came Delphine Dupré, a distant cousin and renowned artist. Her bohemian robes contrasted with the solemnity of the others. She kissed the air next to Geneviève's cheeks, but her gaze was as cold as marble. My Aunt Hélène always believed that art was a waste of time, until it became valuable, of course. The third was Etienne Lavell, the younger nephew, a philosophy student in Lyon, with an absent air and a low voice. He seemed the only one truly affected. "She wrote to me every week," he said sadly. "She talked to me about poetry, about politics, about broken dreams. I never imagined this." Finally, he entered Geneviève, already present the day before. Dressed in strict black, her lips pursed and her hands as cold as marble. "I don't understand why this has to be done so soon," he said quietly to the notary. "There are no answers." Yet Poirot watched their movements carefully, not out of direct suspicion, but because the silences between words interested him more than the speeches themselves. The reading of the will revealed few surprises. Properties distributed according to lineage, jewels and titles for those closest to him. But everyone expected something more, something different, something sealed with blue blood. And that something, of course, was no longer there. When the meeting concluded, Poirot asked to speak to each of the heirs separately. Quand Jacques was direct, Did you know about the letter? I knew there was something. But she played at being enigmatic. She always thought mystery was power. Were you afraid he would change the will? Jacques narrowed his eyes. Not Temer. But if he did, and now he's gone, I'd say someone celebrated with more than champagne. Con Delphine, the conversation took on a theatrical tone. Did you have a good relationship with the Marchioness? Good? My God, no. We had a relationship. Interesting. She despised me for living. Freely, I despised her for living among ghosts. Did you know the contents of the letter? No, but I'd bet it had to do with a family secret. The kind that gets whispered in kitchens when no one's listening anymore. Etienne, on the other hand, offered little, but with sincerity. She said bloodline was a burden, that the Lavell story was a stained painting. Poirot bowed slightly. Did he ever mention a hidden scandal to you? Etienne looked down. Yes, but always in metaphors. He said there was a wolf in sheep's clothing among us. Genevieve, finally, he displayed a disturbing composure. Did your aunt mention anything to you the night of the crime? Just that he had to be there, that what he said would affect me. I thought he'd be talking about me, or my parents, but now, I don't know. Poirot paused for a moment. His eyes travelled over Genevieve's serene face. And yet, mademoiselle, you seem very certain that you were not the target of that letter. She didn't answer, but for the first time she looked away. That evening, Poirot returned to the crime scene. On the desk he found a small notebook hidden among the lower shelves. It was empty except for a hand-scribbled line. The true heir doesn't know he's the heir, but someone does, and fears him. Poirot slowly closed the notebook. There you have it. A blood secret. Maybe illegitimate, maybe shameful, but definitely enough to kill. The investigation was just beginning, but one truth was already becoming evident. The crime was not motivated by common greed. It was for identity, by name, and perhaps for silent revenge. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Family Portrait. The next morning brought a light, almost ethereal rain that darkened the gardens of the Palais de Lavell without obliterating their perfect symmetry. The marble statues seemed to weep silently, and the rose bushes, meticulously tended by generations, bowed their heads with an almost funereal solemnity. Hercule Poirot walked through the central gallery, where the portraits of the Lavells hung, in perfect genealogical order. From the founder, Duke Armand de Lavell, to Helene herself, painted just 2 years earlier by a Viennese artist who, according to rumours, had also been her lover. The detective stopped in front of the portrait of Helene's father. He studied it closely, not out of nostalgia, but for details. The eyes in the portrait were the same ones he had seen on another face, although he couldn't remember which one yet. Monsieur Poirot, a soft voice interrupted. They're looking for you in the library. It was Simone, the Marchioness's personal maid, of uncertain age and with a look that had seen too much. Poirot nodded. Thank you, mademoiselle. And tell me, did you see anything that night? I saw the same old thing, monsieur, he replied without hesitation. People who smile too much, glasses that are filled without being emptied, and eyes that don't cry when they should. Poirot looked at her with a slight inclination of his head, as if he had just taken note of some essential testimony. In the library, the notary Alfred Moreau was waiting for him, with a folder in his hand and an uncomfortable expression. "Monsieur Poirot, there's something you should know. I found it this morning among the Marquise's old papers. It's not the missing letter, but it might be related." He held out a sealed envelope with no return address. Poirot took it carefully and opened it. Inside was a copy of a birth certificate. The name was illegible, intentionally crossed out in black ink, but the surname was clearly legible, from Lavell. The most disturbing thing was the date. Exactly 9 months after the Marchioness's trip to Lisbon, which he always refused to talk about. Poirot read it twice. Then he looked up. "Who else has seen this?" "No one. Just you and me." "So, sir, if this copy exists, the original must be very well kept or destroyed." Poirot asked that all the heirs meet again that same afternoon, not to interrogate them, but to observe them together. He knew that lies were easier to breathe in groups. He sat them down in the gilded hall, beneath the fresco of the Judgment of Paris. The atmosphere was tense, charged with unspoken suspicions. "I've come to share a possibility," Poirot announced. "A hypothesis, if I may. The Marchioness was about to reveal the existence of an unknown heir. A son, perhaps illegitimate. Someone whose name would change the course of this legacy. Does that seem far-fetched to you?" A thick silence took over the room. Delphine raised an eyebrow. "Are you implying there's a bastard among us?" Jacques cleared his throat, annoyed. "There's no room in this family for pulp fiction mysteries." Etienne looked down, uneasy. Geneviève, on the other hand, seemed to freeze for a second. Then she spoke in a controlled voice. "And if such an heir existed, why didn't the Marchioness mention it before?" Poirot approached a window and answered without turning around. "Because maybe he didn't know until recently, or because he knew all along and decided to reveal it only at the end. Maybe as punishment, maybe as justice." He turned to them, and if anyone feared that revelation, then he had a clear reason to silence her before she uttered a single word. The atmosphere became icy. Poirot withdrew without further explanation, leaving behind the seed of suspicion. He didn't want them to confess yet. I wanted them to rat each other out. That evening, Poirot dined in his room. By the dim lamplight, he spread the elements of the case out on the table like chess pieces. The body of the Marchioness was found with the key still around her neck. The letter disappeared without a trace. The traditional will, ignorant of a hidden heir. A copy of a certificate that shouldn't have existed. And a house full of heirs with secrets. Poirot whispered to himself, "The murderer didn't kill solely out of greed. He killed out of fear. And the most powerful fear isn't scandal, but the fear of losing what one already considers one's own." He looked up in the mirror. In his reflection, his moustache was still intact. "Tomorrow, I will look for the one who refuses to look at his reflection." Chapter 4. The Anonymous in the Music Box. Dawn filtered timidly through the lattices of the Palais de Lavell, casting geometric shadows on the Persian carpets and silk-lined walls. While most of the inhabitants were asleep after a day filled with suspicion, Hercule Poirot was already up, dressed in an impeccable satin dressing gown, his slippers neatly lined up at the edge of the bed. On the nightstand, a sheet of paper folded in two protruded from the gap between her teacup and the travel clock. I hadn't been there before. Poirot opened it with a raised eyebrow. The message, typed, unsigned and undated, read, "Look where the music falls silent. The letter is not lost, only hidden by hands that do not tremble." Poirot stood still. Then he folded the paper with millimetric care and slipped it into his inside jacket pocket. "The hands that don't tremble, huh?" he murmured. "And the music? That's silent." Hours later, he appeared before the music room, a forgotten room in the West Wing, where no one else seemed interested in entering since the death of the Marchioness. There, among grand pianos covered with blankets, yellowed sheet music and dusty flutes, he found a small music box mahogany wood on a Victorian dresser. She recognized it instantly. It belonged to Hélène's childhood. It was said that only she knew how to fix it when it broke, and that she had hidden little girlish secrets there. Letters, sweets, and, according to rumours, even confessions. Poirot lifted it with both hands, noticing a slight uneven weight. He turned it, examined the bass, then the musical drum. Something didn't fit. He turned the key. Nothing. The cylinder was stuck. With his gloved fingers, he pressed the barely visible spring on the side, and a hidden compartment opened with a soft click. Inside, there was a letter folded in three, embossed with the Lavell coat of arms, sealed with blue wax, identical to the one found dried on the studio floor. Poirot didn't open it. Instead, he wrapped it in a white linen handkerchief and put it in his jacket. "Voilà," he murmured. "The hidden object has been found. Now, the real game can begin." In the middle of the morning, Poirot summoned Inspector Lemoine privately. "My friend, I found the letter, but I won't read it yet." Lemoine, startled, frowned. "Why the hell not, Poirot? We could solve the case today." Poirot raised a hand. No, it's not about solving it, but about exposing it. If the killer believes the letter is still lost, his actions will speak louder than any confession. What if he attacks again? Then we'll be waiting for him." Meanwhile, in the main dining room, the heirs were beginning to visibly splinter. Jacques and Delphine argued in low voices, throwing reproaches at each other over lost investments, old debts and betrayed alliances. Etienne remained distant, rereading a book that didn't seem to absorb his attention. Geneviève, for her part, never let go of her coffee cup, but she didn't take her eyes off her cousins either. Poirot entered unannounced. "My friends, I ask for a few more minutes of your patience. We'll soon know the truth. But first, I must give a little demonstration." He approached the fireplace. On the mantelpiece was an antique picture frame with a picture of Hélène at 30. Who remembers this photo? "It was taken in Portugal, wasn't it?" Etienne asked, "during a visit with the ambassador." "Exactly," Poirot agreed, "a trip that coincided with a particularly quiet year in the Marchioness's life. No correspondence, no guests, no scandals, just a discreet getaway, and then a return with a new pearl necklace and a less confident smile." Everyone fell silent. Poirot continued, "That trip, I'm afraid, is the key. Because according to my research, 9 months later, a boy was Delphine stepped back. "Do you mean there is another heir?" "No. I say what maybe someone in this room is not who they say they are. Or yes, it is, but completely ignores the weight of his surname." Everyone looked at Etienne. The young man frowned. "They?" Poirot approached slowly. "You, young Lavell, do you have any letters, any documents about your birth? Do you have anything from your mother? My mother died giving birth to me. I never spoke to the Marchioness about her. I only know that she took me in. I always thought it was out of compassion." Poirot smiled softly, almost sadly. "Either out of love, monsieur, or out of remorse." Alone that evening, Poirot unfolded the letter on his desk. The seal broke with a slight creak. He read each line silently. Then he carefully folded it again and wrote a note in his own hand. "Blood may lie in the mouths of others, but not in the silence of paper." The next day he would call everyone together. Because finally, "I knew who killed Hélène de Lavell, and, even more important, I knew why." Chapter 5. The Name That Should Never Be Said. The next day dawned with an unusual clarity, as if heaven itself knew the truth was about to be revealed. Hercule Poirot, always punctual in his habits, stood by his bedroom window, his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on the gardens where the servants were beginning their morning routine, unaware that everything was about to change. Letter found in the music box now lay locked in the inside pocket of his jacket, still wrapped in the white handkerchief. He had read it 3 times during the night, not out of doubt, but out of respect, because it wasn't just a confession, but a final act of conscience. At 9 o'clock sharp, Poirot requested everyone's presence in the Hall of Mirrors. The heirs arrived one by one, like pieces advancing towards the centre of an unfamiliar board. Jacques, sombre and arrogant. Delphine, irritated at having been summoned without explanation. Etienne, nervous, and Geneviève, with her impeccable composure, although something in her eyes was no longer as steady as before. Poirot remained standing, holding the letter, but still closed. "My lords and messieurs," he began clearly, "this letter, written in the handwriting of the Marquise Hélène de Rochefort de Lavell, is not a will, but a testimony. In it she reveals a secret she had hidden for more than 30 years. Not a crime, but a decision. A decision that someone here present did not want to come to light." Jacques sat up straight in his chair. "And what does it say exactly?" "He says he had a son," Poirot replied without hesitation. "Born out of wedlock. His existence was concealed due to family pressure and shame. That son was secretly given to a family loyal to the Lavells, under the promise that his blood would never be revealed." A tense silence descended like a curtain. "And who is that son?" Delphine asked. Her eyes narrowed. Poirot looked slowly at Etienne. Etienne paled. "No, it can't be. You said it. The Marchioness wrote to you every week. She worried about you more than anyone else, but not out of compassion, but instinct. A mother's instinct. She always knew it, though she never dared to say it, until now." Poirot took out the letter, broke the seal, and read, "Etienne is my blood. I denied it out of fear. I hid it on my father's orders. But I've decided to make amends for the past. To my heirs I say, don't fear change, because he is the future Lavell." The room erupted in voices. "That's absurd!" Jacques shouted. "It's a fabrication!" "I want to see that letter," Delphine demanded. Geneviève, on the other hand, said nothing, but her face turned a ghostly white. Poirot turned to her. "Mademoiselle, you knew it." She looked at him without denying it. "Yes, I suspected it. Years ago, I found an envelope in my aunt's desk with a name and a date on it. She never confirmed it to me. But I always knew Etienne had something we didn't." Poirot took a step forward. "And it was you who stole the letter from his study, the night of the crime." A barely audible sigh crossed the room. "I don't," he began. "Ah, but it wasn't you who killed her," Poirot interrupted gently. "No, you found the body afterwards. You stole the letter to protect it, because you knew that if the truth got out, someone would explode." "So who?" Jacques asked, now in a low voice. Poirot slowly turned his gaze towards him. "You, sir." Jacques' face tensed. "Do you have proof?" "I have reasons, and more importantly, I have logic. You were the prime heir. The Lavell name was meant to continue with you. But if Etienne became the legitimate heir, you would lose not only the title, but also the last shred of relevance you had left." Poirot took a step closer. "You were the one who came in through the back door of the studio. You knew how to do it without forcing the lock. You were the only one who knew the antique key that opened that room when you were young. You were the one who fired the vintage gun that disappeared weeks before, and that we still haven't found because you threw it into the river that night." "That's a story, not proof," Jacques said, though his voice was no longer strong. "No," Poirot replied. "It's a deduction. Yours is the only broken alibi. Everyone was in the room during the toast, except you. A waiter has already stated that you were absent for 15 minutes on an urgent call." Poirot raised the letter. "And the most damning thing, his father was the one who arranged for the child to be handed over. You've heard rumours all your life. You always knew there was another. And when the Marchioness finally decided to name him, you couldn't bear it." Jacques sank back into the armchair, silent. He denied nothing, because there was nothing left to deny. Poirot turned to Etienne. "I'm sorry, sir, not because of the blood you carry, but because of the burden you've inherited." Etienne just nodded, speechless, because sometimes a new identity isn't celebrated. It's endured. That night, Poirot packed in silence. The case was solved, but his mind was still reeling from a sentence written in the letter. "Sometimes it's not the blood that kills. It's the fear of losing it." He looked one last time at the portraits in the gallery. They were all still there, eternal, watching, but now one of them knew who he was. Chapter 6. The Curse of the Lavell. The day after the revelation, a strange calm fell over the Lavell Palace. It wasn't the tranquillity of closure, but the heavy weight of what remained unsaid. Although Jacques hadn't been arrested, the formal warrant from the prosecutor's office was still pending. The silence of his guilt had replaced any need for handcuffs. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. The maids spoke in whispers, the corridors echoed emptier, and even the birds in the gardens seemed less inclined to sing. In the music room, the piano remained closed, as if sounds themselves refused to fill the void left by the Marchioness. Hercule Poirot, however, refused to let himself rest. Something still troubled him, not about the murder, that truth was clear, but about the letter, its discovery, and the anonymous message. Hands that don't tremble, he repeated in a low voice as he examined the unsigned envelope for the 10th time. Who left it for me? And more than that, why did they do it without even introducing themselves? Poirot, sitting with a perfectly proportioned cup of coffee, requested another meeting with Geneviève, this time in the greenhouse. She arrived on time, wearing a light grey dress that matched her imperturbable expression. "I knew you'd come back. For me," he said without preamble. "I'm no idiot, Monsieur Poirot." "And I don't underestimate an intelligent woman," he replied with a slight inclination of his head. "Tell me, mademoiselle, why didn't you deliver the letter to me yourself? Why leave it nameless?" Geneviève looked down at a rosebush in bloom. "Because I didn't want to get involved any more. I'd already done too much. Too much for someone who, in the end, didn't deserve it. He means Jacques." She nodded slowly. "He was the one who raised me after my parents died. I admired him, even feared him a little. But when I found the letter that night, after my aunt was dead, I saw him. I saw the terror in his eyes. I knew it hadn't arrived in time. And then I did what I thought was right. I hid it. But then he left it to me, because Etienne needed her more than anyone, and because I no longer wanted to be complicit in the Lavell silence." Poirot was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You broke the cycle, and that, mademoiselle, doesn't make you guilty. It makes you brave." Geneviève didn't respond, but for the first time since the beginning of everything, her eyes seemed to rest. Meanwhile, Inspector Lemoine had returned, with an arrest warrant for Jacques. Upon searching his private quarters, they found a compartment in the false bottom of his briefcase. Inside was the missing revolver, a collectible weapon engraved with the family crest, with a single cartridge fired. A relic turned into an instrument. "Of death," Lemoine murmured, closing the evidence. Jacques offered no resistance. He was escorted through the main entrance without a word, just with pursed lips, and the gait of someone who wasn't asking for redemption, but for silence. A few days later, Poirot was invited by Etienne to walk through the hedge maze surrounding the north wing. The young man was wearing a jacket inherited from his grandfather, and his gestures were no longer those of a shy student, but rather those of someone forced to accept a truth he didn't ask for. "I don't know if I'm a Lavell, monsieur," he said. "Not really. I just have a name, not a story. History is what one makes of it," Poirot replied, pausing to look at a broken statue. "You can rebuild what others have destroyed." Etienne nodded, although hesitantly. "Do you think there's a curse?" he asked. "The Lavells, they always end up like this. Death, silence, shame." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Curses don't exist, monsieur. They're excuses we use to justify our mistakes. But if you want a true definition, I'll tell you this. The Lavell curse isn't in their blood, but in their cowardice to face it." Etienne was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Then I'll be the first not to fear her." Before leaving, Poirot left a small envelope on Etienne's desk. Inside was a photograph. It showed the young Marquise holding a baby with a stray shock of black hair. On the back, written in blue ink, "You were always mine. I just lacked the courage to tell you." Poirot didn't wait for thanks. He walked slowly to the main entrance, where the car that would take him to the station was waiting. Once inside, he adjusted his moustache with 2 fingers and muttered to himself, "A crime revealed, and a son acknowledged. Justice doesn't always come in the form of punishment. Sometimes it comes as the truth." And with that thought, he closed his eyes as Lavell Palace faded behind him into the mist of a new beginning. Chapter 7. The Echo of the Forbidden Name. Hercule Poirot's departure didn't mean the end of the mystery in Lavell. As with any crime rooted in family secrets, his shadow remains, lingering on the walls, in the glances, in the silences at the dinner table. The truth may have been told, but the story wasn't finished yet. The palace reopened its doors to restricted visitors, lawyers, notaries, a journalist from Le Matin, with too many questions and too little discretion, while Etienne, by order of the Charter and without legal objection, was appointed provisional administrator of the estate. The title of Count still had to go through judicial proceedings, but in the corridors no one called him by his first name anymore. One afternoon, while sifting through forgotten documents in the library, debt statements, half-drawn family trees, unfinished letters, Etienne found a loose leaf at the bottom of a family album. It had no date, no signature, just a few lines, handwritten in uneven handwriting. I shouldn't have let them call him that. That name didn't belong to him. It wasn't his, it was mine, and it should have remained mine. The ink, faded by time, seemed to fade more with each word read. Etienne, standing before the large window overlooking the withered gardens, felt an inner tremor. It was the first time he didn't know if he wanted to continue unearthing truths. Who was that message referring to? Her biological mother? The hidden father who was never mentioned? Or perhaps someone closer? That evening, the greenhouse became the scene of an unexpected conversation. Geneviève found him there, holding the note and wearing a sombre expression. "You can't stop now," he told her bluntly. "Stop what? Of searching, of understanding. What you found is only half the map. The other half is still buried, not in the ground, but in pride." Etienne looked at her wearily. "Did you know anything about this? About that other name?" Geneviève walked through the ferns without immediately responding. Then she stopped beside a plant that was already beginning to dry up. "Once, when I was 15, I heard the Marquise arguing with Jacques. They weren't shouting, but she said to him, 'Don't ever say that name again. It's a killer echo.' 'What name?' He didn't say it, but Jacques left the room pale, as if he'd remembered something he was trying to forget. Etienne put the note in his pocket and sighed. Maybe this will never end. "Maybe it shouldn't end," Geneviève replied. "Maybe your role isn't to close the story, but to write a new one." Meanwhile, in the Saint-Vincent prison, Jacques de Rochefort received very few visitors. But one morning, a stern-looking man in a black coat and wide-brimmed hat asked to speak to him. The guard hesitated. The visitor didn't give a name. In the interview room, Jacques looked at him with eyes blazing with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" The man placed a folder on the table. He didn't speak for almost a minute. Then he said, "I was the one who silenced Helene. I was the one who ordered a name erased from the lineage. But I never imagined she would reveal it at the end of her life. I never thought she'd have that courage." Jacques recognized him then, not by his face, which had changed, but by his voice, by the weight he carried. You were the real father." "No, I was something worse. I was the one who refused to be." The conversation lasted only a few minutes. The man left without a trace. But Jacques knew, for the first time, that he hadn't been the only one responsible, just the latest link in a chain of cowardice. At the palace, an unsigned letter was left on Etienne's desk. Inside, just 3 words, written in a fountain pen. "He is still alive." The ink was fresh. Etienne closed his eyes. The echo of an unspoken name resonated louder and louder inside him. And he understood, with a certainty that shot through him like a bolt of lightning, that the story wasn't his alone. It was a net, a ruin, a warning, but also a door. Chapter 8. The Man Who Never Signed. The unsigned letter burned in Etienne's mind like an unremitting fever. He still lives. 3 words, and yet the echo of an undisclosed world. Who was he? And what connection did he have with the story the Marquise had tried to close before she died? For days, Etienne avoided the subject, though every corner of the palace seemed to draw him back toward that mystery. Strolling through the gardens, he thought he saw a face among the statues, one that disappeared before he could reach it. Opening a cupboard in the north wing, he discovered a forgotten walking stick, bearing a monogram that didn't belong to any of the known heirs. A stylized M, etched with fire. That night, he went to the cellar, the most forgotten part of the palace. Among empty barrels and dusty bottles, he found a box of documents marked with a name almost no one mentioned anymore. Mathieu de Lavell. It wasn't part of the will, nor did it appear in the gallery portraits, or even in the genealogical books. But there it was, and there were letters. The first ones were innocuous. Administrative exchanges, property matters. But one, folded and hidden among imported wine papers, chilled his blood. "Helen, I warned you. You weren't supposed to talk about me, not even to him. What would you gain by doing so? Don't deny me the life I chose. I'm no longer a Lavell. I don't want to be one again. Don't seek reconciliation. What we had died when you decided to keep." The last name. Etienne closed his eyes. Mathieu, the real father, the exiled brother, the disgraced heir, the man who never signed. The next day, Geneviève entered Etienne's office with an envelope between her fingers. "This is for you," he said, placing it on his desk. "No return address. But it has the Lavell crest, the old one." Etienne opened it with tense hands. Inside, a single sheet, a map, a schematic ink drawing of what looked like a coastal town in the south of France, and a hand-drawn line ending in a house marked with an X. At the bottom, a message. If you want to know why I didn't sign, come alone. Don't bring up the past. It will come to you on its own." 3 days later, Etienne travelled under a false name and with only one bag. He informed no one except Geneviève, who accompanied him to the station, wordlessly, with a look full of warning. The journey was long. Slow trains, dirt roads, villages where no one asked why an elegant young man with polite manners was asking about a house everyone thought was abandoned. Finally, he found it. A cabin by a cliff. Grey stone, its roof beaten with sea salt. It looked empty, but the door wasn't locked. Inside, dust mingled with the smell of salt. And in a chair by the window, a man stood with his back to her, staring out at the ocean. "I knew you'd come," he said without turning around. Etienne did not respond. "Don't expect tears or hugs," the man continued. "I'm not that kind of father. I never was. I never wanted to be." So why leave the map, Mathieu? Because it couldn't be anyone else, turned slowly. He had the angular face of the Lavells, but his eyes were a different story. There was a dry weariness in them, as if he had paid for his exile not with time, but with conscience. Because someone had to know the whole truth. Your mother died bearing the weight of a family that forced her to choose between me and the family name. I chose silence. She chose the castle, and I was born from that silence, whispered Etienne. No, you were born from the love that existed before it was destroyed. The silence lasted, broken only by the pounding of the sea. And why didn't you sign? Etienne finally asked. Mathieu gave a mirthless smile. Because signing meant accepting that we would abandon you, and I preferred you to think I was never there, rather than you knowing I was gone. Etienne lowered his head. So why now? Because there are no more useful secrets left, only ruins, and because, in death, she was more courageous than I was in life. Back in Lavell, Etienne said nothing to the others. He simply handed Geneviève a handwritten sheet of paper. A new beginning for the family archives, not with inherited names, but with the true story. In the first line he wrote, "Born of silence, but not of shame." And for the first time since he took his place in the Lavell lineage, he knew who he was, not by the last name, but because of what he had decided to do with it. Chapter 9. The Last Inheritance. Etienne's return to the Palais de Lavell was discreet. No speeches, no announcement. No one asked him for explanations, and he offered none. The air seemed heavier than before, as if the walls had absorbed every whisper of the past few days, saturated with truths that could no longer be ignored. Young Eyre didn't mention Mathieu again, not even Geneviève. What had happened on the coast remained there, like an echo that shouldn't disturb the relative peace that now reigned in the house. And yet something had changed on his face. A shadow had left, yes, but in its place was a determination that hadn't been there before. That morning he summoned the notary Alfred Moreau. "I want to rewrite the will," he said bluntly, "and this time not to hide secrets, but to heal wounds." Moreau watched him with a restrained expression. "Are you sure, Mr. Lavell? The process will be closely watched. Many still question its legitimacy." "That's precisely why. It's time the Lavells had an inheritance not built on fear, betrayal, or silence? The notary nodded. He took out his pen and opened his briefcase. Tell me, then, who should receive what? But Etienne stopped him with a gesture. It's not just about sharing. I want you to hear what was never said. Days later, in the large dining room where marriages, pacts, and funerals were once announced, Etienne gathered the last Lavell. Delphine arrived dressed in black, as if Hélène's death still hung on her shoulders like a broken promise. Jacques, of course, wasn't there. Geneviève arrived punctually, without makeup or jewellery, her gaze focused and her arms crossed with discreet firmness. Moreau was also present, sitting in the back, with the new will in a closed folder. Thank you for coming, Etienne began. I'm not going to do a legal reading. What I mean isn't just in the clauses. He glanced over the familiar faces. I've read all the documents, the letters, the silences. I've found the hidden names, the crossed-out lines, the agreements made to protect a surname. But a surname without memory is worthless. He approached the fireplace. There, on the mantelpiece, was a portrait of Hélène that no one had dared to touch since her death. The Marchioness made mistakes, but not the last. That was an act of courage. She recognized me, not by my last name, but by the truth. And that, from now on, will be the only thing the Lavells will inherit. The truth. Delphine snorted. And what truth does a lineage that devoured itself leave us? A lesson, Etienne replied calmly. The ultimate legacy isn't what you sign away. It's what you choose to preserve. The love that survived exile. The family defined not by blood, but by care. History written, yes, but with the trembling pulse of those who learned to speak too late. Moreau stood up and handed over the folder. Here is the new will, signed by me and 3 witnesses. The properties will be divided. The title will be retained, yes, but only as a symbol. What I have instituted is something more important. The open archive of the Lavells. Feel? Geneviève asked. A public collection. Letters, photographs, statements, old documents. Everything that was silenced will be available, not to punish, but to remind us not to forget. Delphine lowered her gaze. She didn't respond, but her expression wasn't one of disagreement. Etienne concluded in a firm voice, This palace has been many things. Refuge, prison, mausoleum. Now I want it to be a memory. That night, alone in the Marquise's office, Etienne allowed himself a moment of weakness. He took out Hélène's original letter, the one that revealed her birth, and read it one last time. Not out of doubt, but out of gratitude. Then he placed it in a display case next to a note in his own handwriting. The truth doesn't erase the pain, but at least it gives it a name. He turned off the light. He closed the door. And for the first time since arriving in Lavell, he slept soundly. Somewhere in Lisbon, an elderly man checked a newly arrived package. Inside, a copy of Hélène's letter and a photo of Etienne in front of his mother's portrait. There was no sender, just a note. You signed with silence. He will sign with history. The man sealed the envelope. He smiled sadly, and then, finally, she allowed herself to cry. Chapter 10. The Name That Will Be Written. The inauguration of the Lavell archive. It was modest, far removed from the Baroque style in which the family usually celebrated their social events. There was no orchestra, no reserve wine, no ambassadorial speech. Just a bright restored room in the east wing, where a long oak table held display cases containing old documents, personal letters, unpublished photographs, and in the centre, under bulletproof glass, the original letter from the Marquise Hélène Etienne stood at one side of the room, without the weight of a surname in his voice, but with the calm of someone who has decided what to do with it. People began to arrive quietly. Historians from nearby provinces, students, discreet members of the cultural press. They weren't looking for scandal, but for context. Among them, Poirot, returned of his own volition, walked with his hands clasped behind his back, pausing before each document with his slight bow, as if the paper were a worthy interlocutor. When he came across the Marchioness's letter, he paused for a long moment. "Ah, my dear Helen," he murmured softly, "in the end your silence was broken with more grace than all your halls." Etienne approached from behind. "I didn't expect to see you, Monsieur Poirot, nor will I return," he replied without turning around. "But some mysteries aren't solved by guilty parties, but by inheritances, not material ones." Poirot turned his face toward him. His moustache was still immaculate, but his gaze held a subtle melancholy. "You have done something remarkable here, Monsieur Lavell." Etienne shook his head with a calm smile. "It wasn't my fault. I just responded to what she started." Poirot nodded. "But almost no one does. The past tends to rust, because no one cleans it up." Over the next week, curious visitors flocked to the archive. Some searched for their own surname among the forgotten family trees. Others simply wanted to take a closer look at the words that sparked a death, and also a redemption. Geneviève, officially appointed co-curator of the archive, worked daily, sorting through the documents that still appeared in dusty corners of the palace. One afternoon, while searching a hidden compartment in the desk of Count Armand de Lavelle's former office, she found a leather-bound notebook. The first pages were blank, but further on, a handwriting unlike Hélène's filled the lines with restrained fury. "Matthew's era. The surname weighs on me, not because of its historical weight, but because I was never allowed to write it in peace. I was offered a shield in exchange for an identity that wasn't mine. I chose to flee, not out of cowardice, but because the Lavell heritage couldn't offer unconditional love." Geneviève read it silently without moving her face. Then she put it in a special box to be included as part of the collection. Those who did not sign. Days later, Etienne called a small press conference, not to announce his new title, which he had decided not to use, but to share a symbolic gesture. "From today on," he said in front of the cameras, "the Lavell Palace will be a foundation, not a museum of the aristocracy, but a space for memory. I don't want the Lavells to be remembered for their scandals, but for their final will to tell the truth." A journalist raised his hand. What would the Marchioness Hélène say if she saw him now? Etienne paused before answering. "Maybe nothing," he said finally. "Or maybe something like, 'Finally, one of us learned to speak without fear.'" That evening, Geneviève and Etienne shared a drink on the veranda. Outside, the rain fell slowly on the freshly trimmed hedges. "Do you think it's all over?" she asked. Etienne looked at the fogged-up window, where the silhouette of his reflection was barely visible. "No," he replied, "but for the first time, I'm not afraid of what comes next." Before leaving, Poirot left a note next to the archive's central display case. He signed it not with his name, but with his initials, and every crime reveals a desire, and every desire a fault, but only the brave turn fault into inheritance. And so, in the heart of Lavell Palace, amidst torn documents and restored names, a new story began to be written, not from the top down, as before, but from within. Chapter 11. The Missing Voice in History. Lavell Palace had been transformed, but not all its corners accepted the change with the same ease. While the light of truth entered through the main windows, whispers still drifted through the narrow corridors, as if the walls couldn't shake off the habit of hearing what shouldn't be said. Geneviève noticed it first. An anonymous note left under the archive door. Then a letter with no return address in the Foundation's mailbox, with shaky handwriting and a red wax seal that hadn't been used for over 50 years. Not everything has been said. Not everything was just silence still protects those who don't deserve it. There was no signature. Unease returned like a chilly breeze. Etienne, who had begun to grow accustomed to the small triumphs of the Restoration, found himself once again confronted by what he feared most, what he didn't yet know. Could this be one of Mathieu's descendants? Geneviève asked as they leafed through the envelope together. Mathieu didn't have any more children. Or at least, that's what he said. And if he lied, to protect who? Etienne remained silent, slowly turning the letter over in his hands. Maybe not another child. Maybe a woman. That same evening, Poirot, still staying at a discreet inn in the village, received an unexpected visitor. The concierge of the former monastery, where Mathieu had been exiled before settling on the coast. She arrived unannounced, wearing a black scarf and a rosary between her fingers. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without introducing himself, "you seek answers, but not all truth belongs to men." Poirot raised an eyebrow, but did not speak. The woman handed him a piece of paper. It was a page torn from a prayer book, with a note in blue ink. The sin wasn't hiding the sun. The sin was silencing her. Poirot read the line twice. Then he looked at it carefully. Who is she? Her name was Isidora. She was the Marchioness's nurse during her pregnancy. No one ever knew she came back afterward. But she did. A Lavell? The woman nodded. She pretended to be a maid. She lived in the shadows. She was here when she died. Poirot returned to the palace the next day with a serious face. He met with Etienne and Geneviève in the archive. "We need to know if anyone named Isidora, or a similar surname, worked here in recent years. Maid, laundress, caretaker, someone invisible." Geneviève immediately went to work, reviewing personnel records and tax files. 2 hours later, she found something. "Here," she said. "Isidora Sells. Hired 6 years ago to help in the North Wing. Infirmary. Temporary work. Not listed in official contracts. Only in a note from Mrs. Duvant, the housekeeper who died 2 winters ago." Poirot nodded gravely. and he disappeared just after the Marchioness's death. Coincidence? Etienne closed his eyes for a moment. Then there was another witness, who never spoke. Or that she spoke, Poirot corrected, and was silenced. Meanwhile, in a small room in the village, a white-haired woman with a hunched back and still strong hands held a tin box. Inside, a broken rosary, a handkerchief embroidered, with the initials HR and a handwritten sheet. It was his confession. Never sent, never read. I was the one who helped her give birth. I was the one who held the child. I know it wasn't Mathieu who tried to silence him. It was his father. He was Lavells' true master. And she never recovered from her silence. I heard her last word. It wasn't help, it was sorry. The woman closed the box. That night he left her at the entrance of the archive unseen. When Geneviève found her at dawn, there was no delivery note, but the handwriting matched the anonymous letter. "The missing voice," he said with a shudder. Etienne carefully opened the confession, and as he finished reading it, he knew that Lavel's crime hadn't begun with a gunshot, not even with an inheritance, but with a broken promise, a forgotten woman, and a story written from only one side. "Now it's done," Poirot murmured, rereading the note. "Now the story is complete." Because in the end, the most necessary testimony came not from the surname, but from the one who silently held it. Chapter 12. Where silence ends, the dawn that followed was different, not because of the weather, which remained grey, mild, almost ceremonial, but because of the way the Lavell Palace held itself between. Its columns not like a monument, but like a body that had finally breathed its last. Silence, for centuries, a curtain covering pacts, omissions, and shame, seemed to have reached its final limit. Etienne entered the archive alone, before the doors were opened to the public. On the central table lay the box that had been left, anonymously the night before. Open, unlocked without threat. Inside, along with Isadora's note, there was something else, a worn gold medal with a barely legible engraved inscription. For the one who spoke when all were silent. For the one who spoke when everyone else was silent. Geneviève appeared shortly after, with the official records of the new archive in hand. "More documents will arrive from the ministry today," he said quietly. "They're giving us scanned family, files dating back to 1813. They include letters from the first Lavell, who was exiled after the fall of Napoleon." Etienne barely nodded. "And yet," he whispered, "the most valuable document arrived in an unsigned box, written by hands that were never invited to dine in this room." Geneviève approached and placed the medal in the centre of the display case next to the Marchioness's letter. "The royal inheritance," he said, "the voices that had no right to speak, but did so anyway." Poirot arrived shortly after. He entered, unannounced, with an expression of contented repose that he rarely displayed at the end of an investigation. He carried a thin folder, unsealed, only a blue ribbon that closed it soberly. "My friends," he said, "before I leave, I wanted to give you this." Etienne looked at him curiously. "What is it?" Poirot placed the folder on the table, "My notes on the case. Not as a police report, but as a map of truths. Not all of them have names, and some can't be verified. but I think they should be preserved, because, as someone wiser than I said, a solved crime is not always an understood crime. Etienne took it in both hands. He didn't open it yet. And you, Monsieur Poirot, are you leaving without looking back? Poirot smiled. I always look back, but I never stop. And in this case, there's something in the past that has finally given up. That evening, the Lavell archive offered its first public reading, a low-key event, without journalists, where villagers, distant descendants, young researchers, and even former servants were invited to read excerpts from the most significant letters. An elderly woman, her voice hoarse, read Isidora's confession. When she finished, the room fell silent, not awkwardly, but reverentially. For the first time, applause wasn't given to a marchioness, a title, or a fortune. It was a truth that was being thanked. Then Geneviève read aloud the last line of Hélène's letter. If anyone has to pay, let it be me, because I was the one who kept quiet first. And then, without any need for ceremony, Etienne took the stage, not with a sheet of paper, not with a rehearsed speech, just with a sentence he had written hours before, and which he now held on a sheet of paper folded in four. The Lavell lineage, he said, is not measured by what we inherit, but by what we choose not to hide. He left the sheet on the lectern. Today the silence ends. Weeks later, the palace opened a new room, small, lacking in opulence. In the centre, a wooden bench faced a single illuminated display case. Displayed there were Isidora's medal, Hélène's letter, the broken rosary, and a copy of the original will. With a note underneath, this room honours those who were invisible. To those who spoke the truth when there was no place for it, to those who didn't sign but supported the story. And with that last room, the echo of the Lavells no longer resonated as condemnation. It resonated as a testimony, in closing. As a start, Chapter 13. The Incomplete Picture. Weeks had passed since the silent ceremony in the Hall of the Invisibles, and yet the air in the Palais de Lavell continued to change. The stillness was not the same as in the days of the Marquise Hélène, when silence was complicit in the unspoken. Now it was a calm charged with respect, with transformation. The entire house seemed to be rewriting itself, and yet something still didn't add up. Geneviève noticed it every time she crossed the west corridor. There hung a large painting, one that hadn't been touched in decades. A family portrait commissioned by Count Henri de Lavell in 1892. It showed him, his wife, Clara, their two sons, and in the background, in shadow, a barely outlined child's figure. The face was blurred, as if the painter had deliberately erased it. "Who is that boy?" Geneviève asked one afternoon, as she passed the painting with Etienne. "A third brother," he replied. "He doesn't appear in the files." Not in the books, not in the letters, but there it is. For years, everyone had assumed it was a blot on the oil painting, an artistic accident. But now that the Lavells' secrets had surfaced, that incomplete face seemed almost like a belated whisper. Yet another echo. "Perhaps it wasn't a brother," said Poirot when asked about the portrait. "Perhaps it was an unacknowledged son, a symbol, or perhaps a warning." Etienne frowned. "Warning of what?" Poirot stared at the painting with the attention he usually reserved for crime scenes. that this family has been hiding names since before they knew how to write them. That night, Etienne went down to the basement, not to the archives or the cellars, but to the lowest level, where dampness pervaded the walls and mould struggled to erase all traces of the past. There, he found a piece of furniture sealed with rusty nails. It took strength and a certain amount of daring to open it. Inside were unsorted papers, letters with no return address, and a thick, dusty notebook. On the cover, 2 almost erased initials, CEL. He opened it. The first few pages were calligraphy, exercises, but further on, he found a story. Today they told me I shouldn't go up to the dining room during dinner. Dad says I'm too pale, that I'll ruin the photos. But Madame Hélène brings me sweets hidden in her handkerchief. She says I'm Lavell too, even though no one else wants me to be. Etienne swallowed. They say I'm the other one, the seamstress's kid. I don't know what that is. I just know that everyone looks at me as if I'm in the way, as if my name doesn't have a home. Page after page, the notebook told the story of a child hidden in his own home, unrecognized, unnamed, nurtured by a young Marquise Hélène, barely 15 years old, who cared for him like a brother, like a reflection of the future she too would eventually hide. The incomplete painting, Etienne murmured. It was real. Geneviève, reading the most intimate fragments, shuddered. And we don't even know what happened to him. Poirot rejoined the conversation, holding up a loose page he had found in the local church records. There was a burial in 1903. No ceremony, no headstone. Name, Charles Lavell, age 12 years. Cause of death, pneumonia. And why hide it? Asked Etienne. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Because admitting it meant revealing an infidelity, a scandal, and something worse. An illegitimate child who should never be painted or buried with a name. The next day, Count Henri's portrait was removed from the corridor. In its place was a discreet display case containing Charles Lavell's notebook open to the page where he had written his first wish. I just want someone to say my name out loud sometime. During the reinstatement ceremony, Etienne did so. Today we honor Charles Lavell, born in this house, lived in its shadows, no longer invisible. The entire room fell silent, but it was a new silence, the silence of the one who listens. Later, Poirot and Geneviève sat on the terrace under a pale parasol, watching the sunset cast amber over the towers of the palace. Do you think we've run out of secrets, Monsieur Poirot? She asked. No, he said, smiling gently. But secrets have no power once they're named. This family has finally learned to name its ghosts. And in that instant, as the sun set and the village bells struck 6, for the first time in over a century, all of Lavell's names were written, read, and finally spoken. Chapter 14. The Last Document in the Marble Box. Lavell Palace, in its shew, new rhythm of guided tours, academic studies, and acts of silent reparation, seemed finally grounded in rediscovered truths. And yet, all who lived on ancient foundations knew that vestiges remained, unearthed not by will, but by the insistence of time. It was during an architectural restoration that the last vestige spoke. A mason, tasked with inspecting the foundations of the family chapel, a small stone structure nestled next to the cypress garden, noticed that one of the marble floor boxes seemed to be sealed with a different mortar than the rest. "There's no name here," he said, wiping the tile clean. Etienne, who had personally ordered that every unmarked grave be respectfully investigated, immediately arrived with Geneviève and a heritage restorer. Poirot, still in the village, joined them shortly after, guided by that sixth sense of his that was rarely wrong when something hidden was about to be revealed. The coffin was opened with great care. It contained no human remains, just a sealed metal box, with the original Lavell coat of arms engraved on the lid, older than the one that appeared in the 19th century documents. When they opened it, they found a single object, a manuscript of at least 150 pages, bound by hand, and a small note inside. This document should be read only when the lineage is ready to face history, as it was. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was firm, archaic, and on the first page of the manuscript the title was clear: Memoirs of Count Armand de Lavell, written in secret. Geneviève let out a pent-up sigh. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, as if feeling an ancestral echo awakening. Etienne, without saying a word, carried the manuscript to the main archive. He placed it on the oak table in front of the glass cabinets where so many other truths had been revealed. Over the following days, the manuscript was transcribed by specialists. It was dense, at times gloomy, and deeply introspective. Through its pages, Count Armand revealed not only the foundation of the surname as a symbol of power, but also the cracks he himself had tried to hide. The Lavells were never a lineage of honour, but of cunning. We survived kingdoms and wars because we learned to keep silent and erase. I write this not for redemption, but for compassion. One day, someone will want to know what lay beneath the marble. The most brutal confession did not come from crimes, but from the deliberate creation of a false lineage, founded on the usurpation of lands, the impersonation of titles, and the systematic elimination of those who could threaten the new surname. In 1743, I didn't inherit the name. I stole it. The revelation shocked everyone. Because if it was true, the Lavell name, admired, feared, desired, was, at its origin, a sham carefully preserved by generations of silence. So what does it mean to be called Lavell now? Etienne asked one night, as he looked through the already digitized pages. Poirot, sitting next to him, replied without delay. It means having the opportunity to do, truthfully, what was previously done with lies. Geneviève, who had read the entire manuscript, added gently, "Perhaps that was Armand's purpose in hiding this. He wasn't seeking posthumous glory. He was looking for someone to stop him, someone to break the cycle." Etienne nodded slowly, with an expression somewhere between gratitude and mourning. The manuscript was added as the centerpiece of a new wing of the archive, the Room of Origin, not dedicated to heroes or martyrs, but to the founders of the lie, to the names that built power through silence, and were now remembered not as punishment, but as a warning. Upon entering, a stone inscription presided over the threshold. Here is where the real thing begins, even if it takes time, even if it hurts. And beneath it, by unanimous decision of the Lavell Foundation, a plaque with a single name never before displayed. Charles Lavell. 1891-1903. The first not to take place. Poirot, before leaving, for the last time, stopped to look at the glass case where the original manuscript rested. Sometimes, he murmured, the truth doesn't resolve, it only reveals. But in revelation, there is dignity. Etienne, standing beside him, replied without solemnity. And dignity. It's the only thing that was never bequeathed. Now it will come first. And so, in a marble drawer designed to hide, what was found was the necessary ending to a never-ending story. Or maybe its true beginning. Chapter 15. The words that belong to no one. The atmosphere in the Lavell archives was beginning to resemble that of a library rather than a mausoleum. The rooms, once cold and guarded by stern-faced portraits, were now filled with visitors, with hushed conversations, with students opening folders with reverent hands. Hélène's letters, Charles's notebooks, and now Count Armand's memoirs had become not relics, but active pieces of a new language, one that sought to heal through memory. But amid all this documentary fervour, there was one thing Geneviève couldn't help but notice: certain gaps, fragments that were named but not explained, letters mentioned by others but never appeared, proper names written with initials, and above all, constant references to a set of writings that no catalogue contained. One day, while reorganizing a set of trunks from the Lavells' old summer library, he found a black folder with no exterior markings. The interior was composed of loose sheets, in no apparent order, and in different handwritings. Each page had something in common, were not signed. They contained no titles, no dates, only confessions, thoughts, wounds. A jumble of voices that seemed to speak into the void. I don't regret not having loved my husband. I only regret not having the courage to say it. I was raised without a name, yet I knew what name belonged to me. I watched my sister die of sadness, and no one recorded her name. I write it here, Aimée. Geneviève knew immediately that this wasn't an official file. It was something more intimate, more dangerous even. Where have you been hiding all this time? He murmured, flipping through the pages. Poirot, upon examining the find, became more thoughtful than usual. They're not documents, he said finally. They're what documents never record. The words that don't belong to anyone, but that nevertheless carry history. Etienne, reading some fragments, proposed a risky solution. Let's show them, not as an archive, not as verified truth, but as collective testimony. Without knowing who wrote them, Geneviève asked. That's exactly why the exhibition was inaugurated under the title Voices without a signature. Each page was transcribed into a sober print, arranged as if floating inside vertical glass display cases. They weren't arranged chronologically, nor grouped by theme. They were chaotic, brutal, tender, true, and no one claimed responsibility. A sign upon entering warned, "This isn't a place to understand the Lavells' history. It's a place to listen to those who lived under it." On the first evening, the audience included writers, genealogists, academics, and former palace employees. Some wept. Others remained silent for a long time. An elderly woman dressed in grey left a folded sheet of paper next to one of the display cases. When she left, Geneviève unfolded it. It read, "I saw when they locked him up." He was 8 years old. He was crying, but not out of fear. It was because they took his notebook. I was just the gardener's daughter, but I never forgot. That sheet was added instantly, because that was the rule of the exposition. Anyone could leave one more voice. There were no filters. There was no verification, just testimony. Little by little, voices without a signature, it became the most visited space in the archive. Not because it better explained the mystery of the Lavells, but because it humanized it. It extended it beyond the aristocratic, the lineage, the crime. It spoke of abandonment, of fear, of family secrets that were not only found in the Lavells, but in every old house in France. Etienne, in an interview with a national newspaper, said something that would be repeated much later. The Lavell Palace is no longer a monument to power. It's a refuge for the words that no one else wanted to preserve. One night, as she was closing the room, Geneviève found a small white stone on one of the display cases. Beneath it, a tiny sheet of paper, neatly folded. My name was never written, but it wasn't forgotten either. Thank you for letting me be here. It had no signature, and I didn't need it, because in the end, the words that belonged to no one had found a home. Chapter 16. The Mirror That Did Not Return the Reflection. As the rooms of the Lavell archive gained notoriety, in reports, articles, and university debates, something else began to happen quietly inside the palace. Regular visitors began to whisper about a room they hadn't heard of before, one that didn't appear on official maps or tours. A grey marble hallway in the south wing, across from the former sewing room. They referred to him as the Hall of the Blind Mirror, and no one seemed to remember when it was last opened. One day, Etienne decided to investigate for himself. Geneviève accompanied him, bringing the original architectural plans of the palace. According to them, the space was supposed to be an abandoned vestibule, closed off since the beginning of the 20th century after a partial collapse of the roof. But the plans didn't match. There was a rectangular room that appeared in the 1874 records, and then disappeared. As if it had been erased, Geneviève whispered, or as if it had been redesigned to not exist, Etienne replied. Flashlights in hand and with absolute caution, the two crossed the wrought iron gate that led to a tiny staircase, eaten away by moss. They descended. The air was cold, and an ancient dampness enveloped their skin like a forgotten memory. At the end of the hallway, a carved wooden double door waited closed, and there, in the centre, an unfamiliar symbol, an engraved mirror, without reflection, an opaque oval without glass. Poirot, consulted that same afternoon, was soon to join the inspection. A mirror that doesn't reflect. Ah, my friends, we're entering not into history, but into the very memory of this place. They pushed open the doors. The room inside was intact. The floor was white marble, with black lines forming concentric spirals. On the walls hung frames, all empty, except for one, a single mirror, rectangular, antique, covered by a black cloth veil tied behind. Poirot, with unusual solemnity, stepped forward and removed the veil. The mirror did not return any reflection de Poirot blanc noir from Etienne, nor of Geneviève. Only darkness. Is it a trick? She whispered. No, said Poirot, touching the surface. "It's a door, or at least a witness." In the following days, they began investigating its origins. In old letters from the 19th century, they found vaguely disturbing references. "Do not allow children to enter the room with the faceless mirror. I had a dream where I looked at myself, and I didn't recognize myself. My sister stopped talking after looking at him too much. It was clear that the mirror wasn't just another decoration. It had been placed there to be feared, or at least to hold something more than a reflection." Poirot proposed a different approach. "There is no reflection, because the reflection was removed. What if the mirror doesn't show what we are, but what we were denied to be?" Geneviève, standing in front of the frame, thought of Charles, of Isadora, of the Marquises, of all the names erased from the lineage. And then she said, "What if we see nothing, because what was denied has no form?" That night, a document was accidentally found behind a loose board in the Marquise's library. It was a short sheet of paper, written in familiar handwriting. It was Hélène's handwriting. "Sometimes Lavell isn't erased with ink. It's erased with silence. The mirror in the south wing doesn't show a face. It shows the gap where one should have been." I looked at it once, and for years I felt incomplete. With this discovery, Etienne ordered the salon not to be closed, nor did he include it in the official tour. But he placed a plaque at the entrance with a single paragraph. "This mirror doesn't give back the face, but it may give back the absence. Not all legacies are visible. Not all ghosts have form. If you enter, don't expect to find yourself. Expect perhaps to recognize what you weren't allowed to be." And the room was visited, but with reverence. Some left in silence, others with inexplicable tears. Many didn't understand what they had seen, but all knew that something finally had looked back at them. A week later, Geneviève walked into the living room alone. She stood still in front of the mirror, and in that absolute blackness, she saw for a moment a face that wasn't her own, but one she knew, an older woman with tired eyes. He had no name, but yes voice. And finally, through that blind mirror, absence also spoke. Chapter 17. The Names That Never Climbed the Main Staircase. The main staircase of the Lavell Palace was the epitome of heritage in stone. 2 wings curving toward a central landing beneath a frescoed dome with allegorical scenes of justice, nobility, and lineage. For more than 2 centuries, only family members and their most distinguished guests had ascended it. Maids, gardeners, attendants, all used the service stairs, hidden behind oak walls or in back corridors. But now the rules had begun to be reversed. The day Etienne proposed holding a ceremony to honour all of Lavells' invisible workers, those who for generations kept the palace's structure alive while being denied official history, many considered the idea unnecessary. "There are no complete records of them," said the local historian consulted. "We barely know their names, and most of their descendants no longer even live in the region." "That's precisely why," Etienne replied, "because they left without climbing these stairs, without being seen, and yet the house stood for them." Geneviève with the help of parish archives and old household records, managed to compile a list of more than 140 names of workers who had lived in Lavell since 1795. Many were known only by their surnames and job titles: Adele, laundress; Georges, coachman; Jeanne, nurse; Michel, kitchen boy. An idea came to Etienne. "We'll have them climb the stairs," he said, "even if it's just symbolically." The ceremony was planned for a grey October day, as the forest wind began to sway the cypress trees in the south garden. No official invitation was sent. Just a simple handwritten letter circulated throughout the village and neighbouring towns. If your family ever worked for the Lavells and was forgotten, we invite you to climb the ladder that was denied to you for centuries. No noble blood is worthier than the one built in silence. On the day of the ceremony, more than 60 people arrived without fanfare. Older men and women, entire families with children. Some carried old photographs, others merely a surname passed down by word of mouth. One of them, an elderly man with a cane, introduced himself as the great-grandson of Isidora Sells. "My grandmother talked about her," he said. "She said she kept a notebook under her mattress with names she was never allowed to say. I'm here for those names." At 11 o'clock sharp, the staircase was cleared. The carpets were removed, the candlesticks were lit, as on formal days. Poirot, present with Etienne and Geneviève, watched the scene with grave eyes. "This isn't a symbolic act," he murmured. "It's a physical rectification. Houses have memories and also pride. Today they're surrendering it." One by one, the visitors began to board. There was no music, there were no speeches, just the steps. Slow, rhythmic, with the silent cadence of a non-religious but deeply spiritual procession. When everyone reached the central landing, names were read aloud, not in order of importance, but in order of discovery. Some names were complete, others partial, others just initials accompanied by a profession. Rosalie, cook; Mr. Martin, gardener; Louise, governess; Baptiste, stable boy; Anouk, Emile, Nadine, Elias. None were omitted, none were corrected. They were all spoken in the same measured voice by Geneviève, as if she were weaving an invisible net over the stairs. At the end, a young descendant of the former youths left a white rose on the 17th step, carved with a crack that no restorer had been able to repair. "My grandfather said his father slipped here while carrying the Marchioness's chair," he said. "He always said the palace owed him a fortune." Everyone laughed softly, even Poirot. "So, mademoiselle," he said with a ceremonious gesture, "the palace pays its debt today, with memory and with laughter." As evening fell, a new plaque was installed at the base of the staircase, without a frame or ornamentation. It bore only an engraving, "For those who walked unseen, for those who held this house up from the bottom. May his footsteps finally resonate in these stones." And from that day on, the stairs were no longer exclusive. Anyone could upload them, because in the end, the names that were never called also lived on every step. Chapter 18. The day Lavell was filled with voices. It was spring when it finally happened. The Lavell Palace, now transformed into a living archive, was preparing for the opening of its final wing. Not an exhibition, not an act of partial memory. This time it would be the synthesis, the closure, the moment when every scattered testimony, every letter, name, whisper, and wound would be assembled in a single room. The Hall of Complete Voices. Etienne walked through the corridors that morning with a mixture of serenity and nervousness. Beside him, Geneviève went over the last details. In front of them, Poirot, who had postponed his return trip to Belgium for another week, walked with measured steps, as if he already knew what they would find at the end of the day. The Hall of Complete Voices was circular. It had no portraits or display cases, only stone benches and a central structure, a glass column within which hundreds of floating fragments rotated, suspended. Some were copies of letters, others anonymous confessions. Some were single words: sorry, silence, bastard, brother, mother. Oh, lighting system projected the words onto the walls, constantly moving. As visitors moved through the room, the voices followed them in whispers. The sound design was carefully executed by acoustic artists, based on the cadences captured from the original testimonies. But that day, something else was going to be revealed. Geneviève, sifting through one last unsorted box, had found an unstamped envelope tucked between the folds of an 1883 ledger. Inside, a letter sealed with gold wax, the same wax used only by the Lavell patriarchs in centuries past. It was addressed to whoever had the courage to open everything. Etienne read it aloud, under the dome of the room. It was I who destroyed the names of the Lavell royal line in 1801, not out of ambition, but out of desperation. My brother Guillaume was the true heir. I was second. He loved a man, and that couldn't be allowed. I forged his signature, I stole the seals, I exiled him to the south. Then I married his fiancée. No one knew. But in every generation I've seen his face reappear, in grandchildren, in gestures, in the trembling of the Lavells' voices. The lineage I built is a lie, but that lie created lives. Who should answer for that? I sign now, as never before, Henri Lavell, impostor by inheritance, Lavell by will. The silence that followed was absolute. Poirot was the first to break it, in a low, precise voice. And so, mes amis, every circle closes. Geneviève nodded slowly. There was no real Lavell line, just people trying not to disappear. Etienne said nothing for a long moment. Then he approached the central column and slid the letter inside. Within seconds, the light began to project new words onto the walls. I lied too. I was secretly Lavell. I lost my name so someone else could use it. I was his reflection. I was the mirror. And then, for the first time since the archive had been inaugurated, everyone in attendance spoke at once. No shouting, no chaos, only voices, names of your grandparents, phrases heard in childhood, questions never answered. It was as if all of Lavell was finally speaking, not in the voice of power, but in the human voice. The palace, built on false lineages and usurped titles, now vibrated with something deeper. A truth that did not demand punishment, but recognition. Poirot, meanwhile, sat against one of the walls. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't solving a crime, but witnessing a healing. It wasn't an investigation, he said. It was a restoration of the soul. Geneviève, standing next to him, looked at him with a restrained smile. "And now you're leaving, Monsieur Poirot." "Yes. This case, finally, no longer needs my grey areas." Etienne turned to them, the last light of day reflected on his face. "And Lavell?" he asked. Poirot looked at him gently. "Lavell isn't just a name anymore. It's a story. And now, it's yours." That night, as the echoes of voices continued to resonate off the palace walls, the sky above Lavell cleared completely, for the first time in weeks. And beneath that new clarity, among cypress trees that no longer hid secrets, the house that was once a prison of names finally became a place of belonging. Not for the Lavells, but for all those who were ever denied by them.